two of them
Okay.
at Lowell and two at Lowell and one at the Museum of Northern Arizona. Then we added two or three talks every year at NAU. And then of course there was all the open houses and the hiking and the workshops and all that stuff too.
Wow, I gotta make it down to Flagstaff once the pandemic
Two
ends
of
to
them
do it
at
in person.
Lowell and two at, you do, or two at Lowell and one at the Museum of Northern Arizona. Then we added two or three talks every year at NAU.
So Elizabeth, do you need
And
to
then of course
mute
there was
your
all the open
speaker?
houses and the hiking.
Sorry about that. That was my YouTube streaming. It was kind of doubling down on what everyone was saying. So that should be fixed. It's a little bit of a weird echo. But anyway, it is 5 o'clock. So I think we'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome, everybody. I have a few housekeeping items to go over, and then we will begin with our talk this evening. And the topic tonight is struggles and identity among Indigenous communities in Honduras. My name is Elizabeth Vogler, and I am the festival coordinator with the Flagstaff Festival of Science. And joining me are Kathy Ferretta, board member, and Fredy Rodriguez, who is here to present on his research. Prior to beginning, I'd like you to know that the festival is live streaming this webinar to YouTube. It's also being recorded so that you can watch it later on or maybe share it with your friends and colleagues. However, only the hosts and the panelists will be visible or heard during the live stream. So you can participate through the question and answer feature, but you will not be on the camera for the recording. This event is part of the Festival of Science, Flagstaff Festival of Science, which we like to call the 10 best days of the year. And our mission is to connect and inspire the citizens of Northern Arizona, particularly youth, with the wonders of science and joy of scientific discovery. You can check out all of our events on scifest.org. And I do want to thank all of our sponsors and generous donors for making the festival happen. We have nearly 100 events during this year's festival. And as I mentioned, everything is on our website, so you can check all that out, including some of the events that require pre-ordered tickets or registrations. So make sure to view all of those options. And we will be putting the festival website in the chat, so you can check that out there. I would like to encourage everyone at the end of this presentation to take a short survey after this one and after any events that you participate in. The data that we collect from this survey is really helpful for us to improve our programs year to year. And you'll be entered into a raffle to win a pair of Apple AirPods after all the surveys are collected. Okay, so the kind of nitty gritty here, if you have questions, which I hope you do, go ahead and ask them in the question and answer box. If you see a question that you like, you can actually upvote it there. If you have any technical problems, then go ahead and put that in the chat, but not the Q&A box. Thank you. So thank you for waiting through this housekeeping, and we're really excited to get going. So I'll go ahead and introduce Fredy. Fredy Rodriguez was born in Honduras and came to the US on a scholarship to study anthropology as an undergraduate student. He ended up staying in the US to continue his graduate studies. He got his master's degree in applied anthropology from NAU here in Flagstaff and went on to his PhD from Michigan State University. His dissertation research examined identity formation at the intersection of gendered, ethnic, and class-based struggles among the Chorti Maya of Western Honduras. After serving as a fixed-term faculty for the anthropology department at MSU, he held a postdoctoral research position at Purdue University, working with a team of researchers studying the culture of undergraduate engineering students, professors, and faculty. He also held a 2-year visiting assistant professor position at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. Currently, he continues his research work with Purdue University. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Fredy. Take it away. We're really excited.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth and Kathy, for having me here today. Good evening, everybody. It's good to be with you. So Elizabeth already talked a little bit about my research, my dissertation research. And so the talk that I'm going to give today deals exactly with that. One chapter of my dissertation on the intersection of gender, class, and identity-based struggle. So the goal this evening is to give you an overview of the history of Chortí Indigenous activism in Western Honduras, to look at the gender struggles and the way they are contextualized in different ethnographic accounts, and to introduce you to how an intersectional approach can help us better understand the relationship between gender challenges, identity, and activism. Some of the questions that I have in mind, that I had in mind when I did this research, include how and why do ethnic and gender identities become relevant in the encounters between the Chortí and non-Indigenous society? What gender dimensions are revealed in these encounters, and how do they speak to the overall struggle of Indigenous people in Western Honduras? And how does the tourism industry contribute to creating new social dynamics in different Indigenous villages? And just to give you a very quick overview about Honduras, for those of you who don't know, it is a very small country at the heart of Central America, with about 9 million people. It's about the size of Tennessee. It has about 9 different indigenous groups, which comprise 7% of the population of the country. The Chortí constitute the 4th largest indigenous group in Honduras, with about 35,000 people in 2001. It's probably around close to 50,000 people in the present. Now, very few people can actually speak the Chortí language, just about 5 people, 5 elders, but there's, as I'm going to explain later, there's some ongoing projects to work with language revitalization initiatives. The Chortí are located around 100 different communities that are spread across the departments of Copan and Ocotepec, as you can see here in the western part of the country, with the borders Guatemala. The Chortí are one of more than 28 linguistic groups, which are descendants of the ancient Maya, and which extend along the region known as Mesoamerica, which you can see here from southern Mexico all the way to Honduras and parts of El Salvador. The people with whom I work live in the villages surrounding the town of Copan Ruinas, which is known to the world because of the UNESCO recognized World Patrimony Archaeological Site that bear its name. This place attracts thousands of tourists from all over the world every year, and more increasingly, tourism is spreading to indigenous communities where tourists interact for the most part with women. The Copan Archaeological Park and the establishment of Honduras as a state or a nation is very much tied to modern day land claims. It's tied to the struggles of indigenous activists and the identity of indigenous people in the area. Now let's take let me give you a little historical context that's gonna help you better understand the story of indigenous activism in the region. So in the year 1893, the Peabody Museum of Harvard sponsored an archaeological expedition to Copan when a lot of the structures were actually buried underground. The expedition not only marked the beginning of the reconstruction of the Copan archaeological site, but also the migration of people from other parts of the region that came to work in archaeological projects. They came to work in cattle ranching. They worked in tobacco plantations. And it also marked the establishment of the town, right, as a municipality. Here's some pictures that I want to show you that sort of depict those times, in the 1890s. Here's a wedding that took place, one of the first weddings that took place in the area. As you can see, some of the Mayan ruins, some of the structures were just left. The town was kind of built around them, so you see a lot of these beautifully preserved structures that were being uncovered around the time. Of course, now all of this, the town, as you can see, the back, some of the pictures that I have before, looks quite different, right? There's a lot of amenities that cater to the tourism industry, but in the 120 years back, right, there was a lot of work that was done because of the archaeology industry. Now let's look at some key historical moments to better contextualize the story of the Chotimaya. And some of you may be familiar with this history, but for some of you that don't, then this will give you a nice little context. So I'm gonna summarize 500 years of events, and I'm gonna try to do it in a minute or so. So in 1502 is when the Spanish get to Honduras. By 1530, Pedro de Alvarado, one of the conquistadors, defeated Copan Calel, who was the last indigenous leader in the Copan region. By then, the Copan Ceremonial Center had already been abandoned, but the Chotimaya still lived in the area, practicing subsistence farming. By the 1600s, indigenous people are forced to work for the Spanish under forced labor systems, such as La Encomienda. La Encomienda was a system in which a Spanish conquistador was entitled to a set of restricted rights to property and indigenous labor that was granted by the Spanish crown. A group of indigenous people will pay tribute to the respective encomendero in the form of labor, money, metals, and any other goods. And in return, indigenous people lived under the care of a given encomendero. The idea is that they would receive protection and they were going to be indoctrinated into the Catholic faith. At this time, indigenous people are called indios or naturales by the Spanish. By the 1800s, many Latin American countries, including Central America, had achieved their independence from Spain. Land begins to be privatized. Honduras begins to consolidate the demographic image of its territory under one nation, right? That means that they're trying to push for they're making any trace of indigenous identity invisible. They're trying to say that everybody is of a mixed ethnicity and race. So at this point, indigenous people are beginning to live in the lands that are owned by the state, right? And that are beginning to be considered mestizos as well. By the 1930s, there is a lot of land privatization. Indigenous people are tricked into selling some of the land that they still have for very little money, or they begin to be absorbed as peons to work for the hacienda system or large states, right? At this point, they become known as mozos colonos, which is a phrase that is used to describe people who work for landowners in exchange for being able to live there and to be able to farm the land and keep some of the produce for them. They pay the landowner with 1/5 of whatever harvest they produce, right? So instead of getting paid for harvesting for the landowner, they have to pay the landowner 1/5 of whatever they produce. At this time, the Chotimaya region is also divided into two different regions when Honduras and Guatemala established a border in 1934. On the Guatemalan side, communities retain a high degree of cultural elements, such as language, traditional attire, and the practice of several traditions, because they live in semi-isolated communities. On the Honduran side, because people were under the control of these large states, people are forced to speak Spanish. They no longer have land to be able to practice some of the farming rituals. and they no longer wear traditional attire. And one important part is that the Mayan ruins are in Honduras, right? So they stayed on the Honduran side of the border, but indigenous people are forced to lose a lot of their identity markers. Between the 1960s and 1980s, we see a surge of campesino or peasant movements that are obviously class-based, that are demanding land from the Honduran government. The state responds by implementing some land reform, but again, it only allows people to work on the land that belongs to the state. During this time, indigenous people became known as campesino or peasant. So you can see the trend, right? How the name of indigenous people is changing in this timeline. Ultimately, from the 1990s on until the present, we see the emergence of ethnic activism in Copan. This is influenced by other indigenous movements in Honduras and Latin America, and also by members of the civil rights movement in the United States that have family ties with some of the African descent population in Honduras. So it's something that happened continent-wide, and it definitely reached Honduras. There's also the work of transnational activists, Honduran anthropologists, workers of non-governmental organizations. They all begin to mobilize different communities, right? And people begin to identify as Chortí Maya. They begin to stage protests in the Honduran capital, and they begin to take over the ecological site of Copan in order to demand land from the Honduran government, right? And also communal titles. Now, the discourse of Mayan identity is born, right, from the activism of Honduran anthropologists, as I mentioned before, who travel to some of the communities during a cholera outbreak in the late 1980s. And what happens is that they begin to recognize, right, when they're trying to help people in the communities, that there's a lot of practices that are taking place in the area, and some of them, including the one famous anthropologist, Lázaro Flores, he begins to realize a lot of these practices are very similar to all of those practices that are taking place in the Guatemalan side. So he says, these people are Chortí Maya. I mean, there's no question. So he begins to work with a lot of them. He helps them establish the National Chortí Maya Indigenous Council of Honduras, which is now one of two really prominent organizations that have helped so much the communities, right, to get projects of revitalization of language and traditions. They begin to teach people about rights. They begin to convince people, right, to join activism, the activism movement. They even pass around, right, like really small books that have the International Labor Organization's Convention 169, which details the recognition and protection of indigenous peoples around the world. And there's even people from Europe that come, right, from Spain, that come to work with Indigenous Council, from the Indigenous Council, and they begin to build all these international links, and they begin to secure different development projects for the communities. So by the late 1990s, the Chortí Maya had already secured some communal parcels of land. They start to practice subsistence farming independently, right, of the landowners. They begin to reintroduce cultural practices such as farming rituals, which they were not able to practice before. Some leaders begin to receive training to become shamans. Others receive training to become language teachers, that is to recover the language. And others receive training to reintroduce the use of indigenous medicinal plants and other edible plants in their communities. So this is how people begin to call themselves Chortí Maya, right? Encouraged from multiple actors. Following these achievements, activism begins to focus on identity formation as well. So as a relational concept, identity is reinforced, right, through the encounters with other people. The same can apply to you, right? You can be You can wear multiple hats on a given day, right? You can be somebody's friend. You can play the identity of somebody's significant other. You can play the role of a professor, a teacher, a student, a supervisor. In other words, your identity at any moment is predicated on your encounters, right, with other people, rather than being a static or unchanging property. So some of the most ethnographically rich sites for looking at these processes, in my case, was looking at the encounters between Indigenous peoples and state officials. In these encounters, Indigenous people, especially activists and entrepreneurs, usually feel sort of compelled to show that they are indeed Indigenous, right? So in these cases, right, gender plays a very, very important role. So to give an example, what do we mean by gender struggles? That is how people of different gender identities experience struggles differently, right? In our case, how being an activist affects Indigenous men and women differently, or how gender identity informs people's attitudes in political mobilization and the tourism industry, right? Let's take a look at a couple of examples where gender identity affects the interaction that Indigenous people had with others. First, let's talk about the celebration of the International Day of the World's Indigenous People, which took place in Honduras in the year 2012. The Choti Maya decided to host it, right? The president, around the time Pepe Lobo came, there was people from the UN, ambassadors from Honduras to other places. There was a lot of politicians, right? A lot of big wigs that came to attend this event. And for these kinds of events, what we see is that women, right, are encouraged to wear traditional clothing, as you can see here. It's almost like they're asked to perform, right? But men, on the other hand, right, they're not. If you can see some of the men that are dressed up here, none of them are dressed in a traditional attire. I'm gonna go back to the leader of the council at the time too. It's the same, right? And when you see some of the attires that are displayed, they're all the attires that are traditionally worn by women, right? So you begin to see here that women are sort of given the responsibility of showing, right, their sense of indigeneity. In other words, they're supposed to represent, right, tradition as an everyday life practice. Such traditional representations are supposed to be consumed by the audience as authentic, right? But women are not happy with this, right? Some of them resent, right, men for not sharing the responsibility of wearing traditional dress, but they also feel proud. They feel proud of having that role, right? Because they argue that it really helps the political movement as a whole. So women actually, some of them see this practice as a source of empoderamiento or empowerment, right? For example, during a focus group that I led with activist women, they talked about the gender dimensions of wearing traditional attire. And when I asked, for instance, one of them, when I asked the group, right, why men did not wear traditional clothing during the encounters with the state officials, one of the participants said, well, he said, it is machismo. They tell us that we should all dress like that, like wearing traditional attire, but men do not like to do it. Similar to us, it says, women, we rarely like to dress like that as well. The participants explain how every time they dressed with the traditional clothing, non-Indigenous people from Copan would ask them with a tone of mockery, right? Where's the dance? Another participant says every time she will walk around the market with her outfit, people will yell, the witch is coming. So despite describing these episodes with a resentful tone, women continue to use the word empoderamiento or empowerment to refer to wearing this attire, right? One participant said it has to do with rescuing our culture. It is a form of empowerment. That means that we can also do it. Another person said, we need to empower ourselves from that which is ours, and so should men. We will come back later to this issue why men do not want to dress up in a traditional attire. Second, let's look at the tourism industry, right? It offers us a different perspective where identity, performance, commodification, and livelihood strategies have become highly intertwined. For example, now it has become common for tour guides to take tourists to some indigenous communities to see how indigenous people live or to purchase different souvenirs. In interviews with women, they who are the ones who mostly interact with the tourists, they recall instances when tourists would ask them, why aren't you at the Mayan ruins? Or why don't you speak the language, right? So the tourism advertising industry really contributes to this idea, right? That they need to sell the image of Maya women through Mesoamerica as the bearers of Maya culture. But that creates a lot of different conflicting sentiments for women, right? Especially for a lot of people who do not know how to speak the language, right? Now let's look at a few ethnographic vignettes to highlight some of the things that I've discussed so far. Let's talk about Dania Maria. She's 50 years old. She's a Choti Maya indigenous activist and an entrepreneur from a village in Kupang. She belongs to one of the founding families of the village. She has great interpersonal skills. She's charismatic. She's socially active. She secured a grant from the World Bank, right, through her connections, and was able to build a beautiful store where she was selling natural jewelry, right? She trained other indigenous people to work with her, and then tourists will come to the village, and she became really successful, right? Because they were buying a lot of this beautiful jewelry from her. So the success that she had led her to be really popular. She developed a lot of connections in the town. She developed more opportunities for professional growth and even more activism networks, right? So now let's look at the story of Dania Maria from the point of view of the development agents who promoted this grant. The World Bank releases the call for a grant that is targeting women, right? Indigenous applicant gets the grant. She builds a natural jewelry store. The tourism increases in the village. The applicant does really well economically. And this newfound wealth allows applicant to grow her social capital, to travel and connect with other activists, right? Now, but after spending a lot of time in this community, right, I began to figure out that a lot of Dania Maria's success came with just as many challenges, right? She actually encountered a lot of problems because she was so successful, right? She first of all, because most people in the community were really poor, they saw it as a threat. The fact that this newfound success was very individualistic, right? By nature, right? The nature of most capitalistic enterprises tends to be individual success, right? So that shared view of being poor got broken down in this community, broken up in this community, right? The new economic opportunities for women also altered traditional household dynamics that usually were dominated by men, right? So it was great that a lot of women felt in power, but it also created a lot of problems in their own relationships. Dania Maria even received death threats when she would come back to the village after 7 p.m. Because it's a very men-dominated village. So it was so hard that she could not maintain her business. Tourism was fluctuating, and because of the community challenges, this really did not make it easy for her to keep her business. She even fought with the rural council of indigenous people. Most of them were who were men, right? They broke into the store, they took everything from her, and eventually the building was destroyed. So in essence, when we look at the story of Dania Maria, we don't see, right, such a successful picture as one that might be presented by a development agency, right? We see the story will be more like this, right? The World Bank sends out the call for the grants. The Indigenous applicant gets the grant. She builds a natural jewelry store. The tourism increases in the village. The applicant does really well economically, but people in the community begin to resent her, right? For this newfound sense of success. There's a disruption of the sense of communal struggle that was informed by activism. There's the newfound wealth allows applicants to grow social capital, travel and connect with other activists, but marital challenges and Indigenous council problems end up destroying her store. So we see a much different picture when we apply, right, an ethnographic approach to the dynamics of the village, right? Now, we're gonna talk a little bit about intersectionality as one of the learning objectives and apply the case of gender struggles that we examined earlier on. Intersectionality was coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s, and it was referred to as the idea that when it comes to thinking about how inequalities persist, categories like gender, race, and class are best understood as overlapping rather than isolated and distinct. For example, an Indigenous woman might be discriminated against because she is both Indigenous and because she is a woman, right? Now, let us use intersectionality to understand why Chutimaya men don't like to wear traditional attire, right? After spending enough time in different communities, I was fascinated to learn that men, when they travel outside of Copan, they were happy to wear Indigenous clothing, right? So the issue was not that they didn't want to wear Indigenous clothing, is they didn't want to wear Indigenous clothing in Copan, right? So can anyone guess why it is that men do not like to wear traditional clothing? Why do you think that men don't like to wear traditional clothing in Copan? If anybody can use the Q&A to type any ideas that you may have, I'll be happy to engage with you.
Fredy, are you able to see that?
Yeah, I'm able to see it. Somebody says that the clothing is too hot. Well, actually, it's the clothing actually that they wear because of the material is linen is actually really appropriate for the climate. Susan says shame, and Susan is absolutely correct. The reason why a lot of men don't like to wear the clothing is because of a sense of shame. So using an intersectional approach, we actually find that behind the decision of wearing or not wearing traditional clothing is a long history of subjugation, right? Related to class-based struggles for men, which eventually end up affecting women as well, right? In other words, issues of gender and class are very much connected to one another, right? I found that for men, right, the feelings of embarrassment associated with wearing traditional attire were tied to Indigenous men, particular history, right, of subjugation between themselves and former patrones when they worked in the hacienda system and they were forced to wear this kind of clothing, right? So even though the same attire has been reintroduced as a symbol of culture and pride more recently in the 1990s, for most men, it's reminiscent, right, of the times when they lived under landowners' control for close to 70 years prior to that. So by emulating the dress of non-Indigenous society, in Copan, men are actually resisting, right, a symbol of subjugation rather than trying to assimilate. Thus, it is important to consider the gender dimensions, right, of wearing traditional attire, not as a simple men subjugates women practice, or as Juan Chortí said, right, machismo, but rather as the particularities of how Indigenous people experience subjugation, or have experienced subjugation in the past or across time, right? Now, the last vignette I'm going to talk about today deals with the issue of other kinds of disparities, right? Being a participant observer, I found, for instance, let me read you Don Carlos's story. He's also in his 50s. He formerly worked as a peasant farmer for non-Indigenous landowners. Through activism, right? He recovered his land. He began to identify as Maya. He became really powerful in his community, right? But similar to other people in the area, right? He no longer depends on former patrones, right? He can farm his own land. Remember that in the past, right? They used to even ask for permission to the landowners to be able to leave the land and go to the town, to walk to the town. So they were incredibly subjugated, right? Now, after being a participant observer in that area, I found out that Carlos actually was still working for his former landowner. He wasn't telling anybody, right? But he was kind of working for the same guy without the knowledge of the Indigenous Council or anybody else, right? And then I found out that other people, right, that were prominent activists were also working for former landowners and even supported them as they ran for political office, right? In fact, foreign activists were so pissed, right? They were so upset at any connection that Indigenous people that were not working independently would have with any people, right? Any people that used to control them, right? And some of them even said, if I see you working or interacting with your former landowners, I will not gonna work with you again, right? But finding out that they were still connecting with their former landowners told me a lot, right, about how about the enduring power of control and how it's something that may take years, right, to overcome. In closing, right, we find in Copan that gender struggles really reveal how people of different gender identities may experience struggles differently. Maya women's struggles are prominent in activism and the tourism industry. However, an intersectional approach can give us a more nuanced understanding of how oppression actually works. And doing ethnography can also help us, right, gather information from multiple sources in order to create a fuller picture of a given issue or situation. Thank you so much for listening to my talk. Now I will take some questions.
And Fredy, I'll jump in here for a moment. Thank you so much. That was really a lot of great information, a lot of new information for me, and I hope for all of our viewers today. And I see that you popped onto our survey slide, so I'll take another 30 seconds or so to talk about some housekeeping stuff before questions. If everyone who's watching today or maybe watching later could fill out the survey online, it's going to be at our website, which is scifest.org, or if you'd like, right now, you can just scan that QR code using your phone on your computer screen and then save the survey to maybe fill it out later this evening when you have some time to digest tonight's presentation. And each time you fill out a survey as you attend different events, you do get entered to win a pair of Apple AirPods. And if you could just switch to the next slide there, Fredy. Did I give you one more slide? Oh, there we go. I want to give a giant shout out to all of our sponsors. As you all know, our attendees, this is an entirely free festival for viewers and community members to attend the different activities, and we couldn't do it without our sponsors. So thank you so much to all of our sponsors of the Festival of Science. And I'll go ahead and read this first question out for some of our viewers who might not be on the webinar and can see it themselves. Fredy, have you had much interaction with the younger generation of Maya who haven't experienced transitional identity in the ways that previous generations did? In what ways do these younger generations differ in their ideas of identities from previous generations?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I actually did we got a grant from the Inherent Foundation which does a lot of work with Mayan populations. And I worked with an archaeologist, actually. We went and did an applied anthropology work with an indigenous high school. And what we found is that the younger generations, their sense of identity is a lot stronger than their parents' is. And it's because they grew up with all these language revitalization initiatives. Remember that the state is now, because they want to take advantage of indigenous identity and they want to, for the purpose of tourism, they're trying to really now make indigenous people more salient, right? In the past, they try to make them invisible. And now, because it's convenient for the state, because of the tourism revenue, they're pushing right there, like bringing teachers to teach indigenous people how to sing the national anthem, right? In Maya, how to say a few phrases. And so the sense of identity, I think, among the younger generations is a lot stronger. And actually, I just read an announcement today that the first doctor from that area, the first indigenous doctor, just graduated today, and is going to go back to her village to open a clinic. They have been training a lot of teachers, right? A lot of elementary school teachers to go back to the villages and also work with elders and with younger populations. So I honestly think that the identity is going to be a lot more marked among these generations.
Thanks, Fredy. And I had a question for some of our viewers who might not be as familiar with the study of applied anthropology. You had mentioned doing some focus groups and participant observation. What are some of the research methods that you use in applied anthropology? And in this research, how do you decide, when it's the appropriate time to maybe select one method over something else?
That's a great question. So I think when it pertains to applied anthropology specifically, we work with the mind frame that we are not just studying given phenomena and writing about it from the point of view of theory, right? Which is what a lot of dissertations do. But mostly, as an applied anthropologist, we really tend to work with indigenous leaders to help solve any issues that might be emerging right in the area. So I did, to be honest with you, the bulk of my dissertation came from my ethnographic notes, from my participant observation notes. I wrote a lot of the interviews were great, right? But keep in mind that when you do interviews, people might feel compelled to give you a given answer because of the issues of power, right, between researcher and participants. So in order for you to ensure that you're actually witnessing something of that will be useful, you need to be there with people. And so I think I really push for that, for being present as much as you can in whatever it is that people are doing, and also giving your contribution, right? If they need your help, for example, I was working with Indigenous, with the Indigenous Council of Women, right, within that organization. And I remember that they were offered the chance to come to the US to give some workshops. Well, a lot of the women didn't have anybody to help them fill out the applications for the visas. And so at some point I was there just helping them translate or helping them fill out visa applications. And a lot of them were able, after that happened, a lot of them were able to get visas to come to the US and come to talk about the Chotimaya experience, or come to learn to do different kinds of handicrafts, right? That were able to, that were really helpful for them to go back to Honduras and create their own handicrafts to sell, right? And among tourists.
Thanks for explaining that. I think we have one more question that I have from another platform here. What do you think would be a good subject of study for future research in Copan, or future researchers that are interested in studying there?
That's a great question. I think that what I mentioned before, work with the younger populations, the younger generations, and trying to understand how identity has become transformed because of all the work that the state is doing, right, and activists are doing to revitalize identity. How is that affecting the younger generations? Because their parents had a really difficult time, right? A lot of them, in my work, I found that 90% of them actually didn't know how to read and write. And so even if the state wants to come and give them materials, right, to read about history or whatnot, it will be too difficult for them to digest that kind of information. The new generation, for them, is a lot easier. So I think being able to understand how identity is actually being understood or being lived by the younger generations would be a really good topic to study.
Thank you so much, Fredy. Dr. Rodriguez, we're thrilled to have you a part of the Festival of Science this year, and hopefully you'll be able to come back in the future. We look forward to that, and I'd like to thank all of the attendees and viewers for tuning in today, and we hope you have a great rest of your week. Don't forget, there's still let's see, what is today? It's Tuesday. So there's still 5 more days of festival activities coming up. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.